The Zorth had never been challenged before. Their ships loomed over Earth like a dark sky, promising a storm none could outrun. Commander Velker had seen it all. His species had raised planet civilizations were crushed beneath their might, and their advanced technology was feared across the galaxy. So when they arrived in Earth's orbit, they expected the same easy conquest. They had grown accustomed to Earth's primitive defenses, didn't even register on their scanners. At first, their intelligence reports spoke of a species too weak to resist and too divided to unite against them. Velker's fleet descended in a terrifying array of warships, cutting through the atmosphere as they deployed thousands of soldiers across the globe. The people of Earth barely had time to react as cities were bombarded and decimated by the Zoreth's weapons. The planet's leaders scrambled to mobilize their forces, but their weapons were nothing compared to the aliens' devastating arsenal. When the first Zorth dropships hit the ground in New York and Los Angeles, the world's armies crumbled beneath the overwhelming firepower that tore through buildings and left entire battalions in ashes. But there was one thing the Zorth never anticipated: humanity's ability to adapt under the surface of chaos and destruction. A different force began to stir. The people of Earth were not just survivors, they were fighters. People like Colonel Mark Trent had been preparing for something like this. His military unit stationed in Nevada had been on high alert for weeks. The government had been receiving warnings and strange signals that hinted at something foreign beyond their atmosphere, but no one had been able to make sense of them. Until now, when the Zorth landed, it wasn't just soldiers they were dealing with, but ordinary civilians who had been watching their world fall apart. And when the call came from Colonel Trent for a counterattack, people from all walks of life joined the fray. A small group of soldiers, led by Colonel Trent, launched an offensive against the Zorth forces that first struck in Los Angeles. They had no advanced technology, no alien weaponry to back them up, just their training and their will to fight. But what the Zorth didn't know was that humanity's true strength wasn't in the weapons they carried. It was in their ability to think on their feet, to learn to adapt in the heat of battle, and most of all to fight with an intensity no alien had ever seen before. The first counterattack was a disaster for the invaders. They thought the human soldiers would scatter and run, but instead they found themselves being hunted by an enemy that had no fear. Their tactics were unconventional, unexpected, and brutal in ways the Zorth could not comprehend. The human fighters didn't care about honor or rules of war. They used the terrain to their advantage. They attacked from the shadows, used guerrilla tactics, and left traps everywhere. The Zorth soldiers were caught off guard more than once, finding themselves ambushed and overwhelmed by a force that had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Velker was not pleased as his commanders reported back with news of the unexpected resistance. The Zorth had expected to face primitive fighters armed with outdated rifles. Instead, they found themselves battling an enemy that knew how to strike where it hurt and vanish before they could retaliate. As the battle raged on across the globe, the Zorth began to realize something terrifying about humanity. These creatures were not as weak as they had thought. They were dangerous, resourceful, and willing to fight until the last breath. The invaders were beginning to feel fear for the first time in ages, and it made them question their belief that they would easily conquer Earth. The Zorth commanders were growing anxious as human resistance spread across the planet like wildfire. What had started as a handful of skirmishes had turned into a global uprising. Colonel Trent's tactics were beginning to show results as small but highly effective resistance groups formed all over the world. People from all walks of life had come together as one unstoppable force in their desperation to protect their homes. The humans had no advanced weapons or ships of their own to match the Zoreth's technologically superior armada, but they had something far more dangerous. Their sheer will to survive was unmatched. Nowhere else in the galaxy had any species displayed such a tenacity for life. Each human was willing to risk everything to stop the invasion, even as the skies above Earth were lit up with Zorth warships, and their deadly weapons rained down upon cities. The human resistance never faltered. The civilians who had once cowered in fear found courage in the face of their invaders. They worked with the soldiers to organize ambushes and sabotage alien tech using whatever they could find. Homemade explosive scraps of alien technology, and sheer human ingenuity that the Zorth couldn't anticipate. Colonel Trent understood better than anyone the importance of striking fast and striking hard. They couldn't afford to wait for reinforcements. Earth's military was no match for the advanced alien weaponry, but they had the element of surprise on their side and the strength of numbers. They started with what seemed like impossible missions. Small groups infiltrated enemy strongholds and liberated key areas across the world, all the while avoiding direct confrontation with the Zorth's heavily armored forces. Instead, they relied on diversionary tactics and guerrilla warfare designed to wear down the invaders' resolve. Earth's scientists like Dr. Alex Hayes worked tirelessly to reverse engineer the alien technology they had seized from downed ships and captured soldiers, but the Zorth had underestimated how quickly the humans would learn to adapt. From every destroyed alien craft and every captured Zorth soldier, the humans gained more knowledge to exploit. The resistance fighters discovered that the Zorth's technology was vulnerable to a simple EMP pulse, and with a small team of engineers, they created an electromagnetic device that could disable the Zorth's advanced weaponry for brief periods of time. Colonel Trent knew this was their chance to take the fight to the invaders in a way that would cause them to question their own superiority. In the middle of a large-scale Zorth invasion of a major city in Europe, Colonel Trent ordered a surprise attack using their new EMP technology. The humans targeted the Zorth's air superiority by knocking out their weapons and communication systems long enough for ground forces to overwhelm the disoriented invaders. The attack was a success, and the Zorth forces found themselves retreating for the first time. Since their arrival, the Zorth had never experienced a true defeat, but this was different. The resistance wasn't just holding ground, they were gaining it step by step, city by city. As Velker's commanders reported these losses back to him, he could hardly believe it at first. He refused to acknowledge that the humans could actually be winning ground. It was an impossibility. The Zorth had faced down countless species throughout the galaxy and crushed them effortlessly, yet now they were facing something entirely new, something they had never encountered before, a species that did not fear them and was willing to fight at any cost. With each victory, the humans proved one thing: the Zorth were not the apex predators of the galaxy. Humanity had shown them the brutal truth. They had underestimated their enemy, and now they were paying the price. As the days passed and the tide of battle shifted, Commander Velker could no longer deny the reality that the humans were not as weak as his intelligence had predicted. The invaders' losses were mounting and their morale was crumbling, while human forces seemed to grow stronger with each victory. Velker had seen the reports of human soldiers using their own bodies as weapons, forcing the Zorth to rethink their entire strategy. Their technology was superior, their firepower unmatched. But the humans had one thing that the Zorth couldn't replicate or understand: an unyielding will to survive and adapt to any circumstance. This realization came too late. The Zorth had underestimated the humans' ability to fight, and more importantly, to outthink their invaders. Colonel Trent's tactics had left the Zorth on the back foot for the first time since their arrival, and as the resistance groups coordinated strikes across the globe, Velker's forces began to experience significant setbacks. The Zorth fleet had been thrown into disarray after a surprise assault on their command ship, and with the EMP weapons crippling their ground forces, they were forced to rely on increasingly ineffective countermeasures to hold back the human tide. Velker convened a high-level strategy meeting with his commanders. None of them had any answers for what was happening. The humans were not only surviving, they were winning, and doing so in ways that defied every military tactic the Zorth had ever studied. At first, they tried conventional methods of retaliation, striking at cities and military bases with overwhelming force, but it didn't work. Each attack seemed to rally more and more humans to the resistance instead of breaking them. Velker's frustration boiled over as he demanded his forces adapt and respond in kind, but they were being outsmarted at every turn. The Zorth had never fought an enemy that could move with such unpredictability and creativity, and it was becoming clear that the humans were learning and evolving faster than the invaders could adapt. Meanwhile, Colonel Trent and his team were already planning their next move. The humans had learned quickly that the Zorth relied heavily on their advanced communication systems, and if they could disrupt that network, they could cripple the invaders' coordination. But they needed more than just a few isolated skirmishes. They needed to hit the Zorth where it would hurt the most, and with the element of surprise on their side, they had no intention of wasting it. Trent's plan was simple yet dangerous: infiltrate one of the Zorth's largest supply depots, deep behind enemy lines, and destroy their communication array once and for all. The mission would require precision, and the humans knew the risks, but there was no choice. Earth's survival hinged on this daring operation. The team, now led by Sergeant Amelia Brooks, included soldiers, engineers, and specialists who had grown accustomed to working in the shadows and using the Zorth's technology against them as they prepared for the assault. Trent knew they couldn't afford to be caught off guard, even for a moment. Their objective was clear: disable the Zorth's communication systems to disrupt their supply lines and stop their reinforcements from reaching the front lines. But the Zorth had learned, too, that the humans weren't predictable, and now they began to make their own countermeasures. Their surveillance network had tightened, and any human movement was met with swift retaliation as the Zorth adjusted their tactics to prevent further infiltration. But Trent's forces had already anticipated this. The humans adapted quickly and launched the assault under the cover of night, with a coordinated strike that forced the Zorth into a chaotic retreat. The communication array fell, and with it the Zorth's tight grip on Earth loosened for the first time in months. Commander Velker, now realizing the true danger of this conflict, ordered a full-scale retaliation, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in the Zorth ranks. They had underestimated humanity, and they were now paying the price. The moment the Zorth communication array was destroyed, a wave of chaos swept through their ranks. The once perfect coordination of their military operations began to fragment. Their once formidable assault groups faltered, and their supply lines began to buckle under the pressure of constant human attacks. The Zorth fleet, crippled by their inability to communicate effectively, scrambled to regain control, but they were constantly being outmaneuvered by human forces who had no intention of allowing the invaders a chance to recover. For the first time since their arrival, the Zorth commanders began to realize that this war was not going to be won through brute force alone. They were facing an opponent that could adapt faster than they could ever anticipate, and every time they learned something about humanity's tactics, the humans were already one step ahead. The realization that they were not fighting just another primitive species began to sink in slowly and painfully. Velker paced back and forth in his command chamber, fuming with frustration. His once confident demeanor had turned into one of doubt and uncertainty. He could feel the tide turning against him, but couldn't figure out how to stop it. How were they losing to creatures so inferior in technology? He demanded of his generals. One of the officers spoke up hesitantly, suggesting that the humans' greatest strength was their ability to improvise and use anything at their disposal as weapons. Even the simplest tools could be turned into deadly instruments of war. Velker's frustration only deepened as he reflected on this. Humanity's sheer unpredictability had caught them off guard in ways that no other species had ever done. And it seemed that no matter how many resources the Zorth threw at Earth, the humans were always able to turn the tables. This was no longer just a military conflict, it was a battle of wills, and the humans were determined to win. After the destruction of the communication network, Colonel Trent's forces didn't stop there. They had tasted victory and knew that the only way to finish this war was to cripple the Zorth once and for all. They began striking at supply depots, fuel stations, and weapons caches across the globe. They took out the Zorth's infrastructure piece by piece, creating a slow but inevitable collapse in their military strategy. Meanwhile, resistance groups continued to grow, and Earth's civilians joined the fight in unprecedented numbers. While the Zorth had come to Earth expecting to conquer, they found instead that the planet's people had become a force of nature that they could no longer control. The Zorth's mistakes were becoming too many to count, and each one was costing them more than they realized. The alien empire, which had once seen itself as the dominant power of the galaxy, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of human resistance. As Velker's forces began to shrink and morale dropped, whispers of fear spread through their ranks. If they didn't retreat soon, the entire Zorth Empire might collapse, their once proud fleet reduced to scattered remnants across Earth's surface. Back on Earth, The resistance had begun to turn the tide decisively. They were no longer just defending their homes. They were hunting the invaders the human spirit had awakened, and with each victory, their resolve grew stronger. They had learned to exploit the Zorth's weaknesses, and now they were using those weaknesses against them at every turn. The human fighters had become like ghosts to the Zorth soldiers, moving in and out of cities with lightning speed, striking before the invaders could react, then vanishing before they could retaliate. The Zorth were overwhelmed with their inability to keep up the speed and ferocity of the human attack, and as they looked toward the sky, they saw something they hadn't expected. A fleet of human ships arriving at Earth's orbit. A fleet of human-made warships ready to engage in space battles that would further tilt the scales against them. The humans were no longer the underdogs, and Velker knew it too well. He was fighting not just to conquer a planet, but to prevent his species from being annihilated. Commander Velker watched helplessly as his empire's hold on Earth continued to unravel. The once mighty Zorth fleet now found itself constantly on the defensive, retreating into their damaged strongholds as human forces tightened their grip on the planet. Every day, the Zorth found themselves losing ground they never expected to lose. The humans had proven that they could adapt and fight with a ferocity that no other species had ever shown. It became clear that humanity was not just defending their home. They were dismantling the Zorth's empire piece by piece. It was no longer a question of whether the humans would win, but when the Zorth had made their first mistake, underestimating humanity's ability to fight back, they had sent waves of troops expecting to crush the resistance with ease. They believed that Earth's primitive technology would be no match for their superior firepower. But what the Zorth failed to account for was the sheer resourcefulness of the human spirit. The destruction of their communication network had been the turning point for Velker and his commanders. But the human victories didn't stop there now. Their forces were beginning to take out entire Zorth supply depots and weapon caches, making it impossible for the invaders to sustain their war effort. Every strike was a blow to the Zorth's already fraying cohesion. Each victory by the human resistance was another crack in the foundation of the Zorth military structure. Even the Zorth generals, who had once led their forces with unshakable confidence, now found themselves questioning their tactics. Their grip on Earth was slipping faster than they could tighten it. The human forces had begun to show an uncanny ability to predict their moves and strike with precision. Every time the Zorth began to regroup, the humans were already there waiting for them, with new weapons, new traps, and new ways to use their environment to their advantage. The invaders' technology, once thought to be invincible, had been adapted by human engineers like Rachel Green and Lucas Carter into weapons that struck at the very heart of the Zorth's strength. Earth had become a battlefield where the humans' adaptability had turned every weakness into a strength. Every street, every building, every forest became a weapon in the hands of the resistance, and the Zorth were losing not just soldiers but morale. The Zorth soldiers, once feared across the galaxy, were now scared to fight against the humans. Each clash left them more rattled than the last. Their superior weapons became less effective as the humans learned to use their own tech against them, hacking into systems and turning alien devices into deadly traps. They had underestimated human ingenuity, and now they were paying the price. Colonel Trent and his team had become legends among the resistance. Their guerrilla tactics were so effective that the Zorth began to refer to them as ghosts, fighting forces that vanished into thin air before they could be countered. The resistance was everywhere, and every Zorth commander knew it. It was as if the humans had the ability to predict their movements, to be one step ahead at all times. The Zorth had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest, but instead they had found a species that fought with a cunning and relentless drive that could not be measured by technology alone. Even as the alien forces struggled to maintain control over key regions of Earth, Velker began to realize that they had not only lost the war for Earth, they had lost something much greater. They had lost the fear they had once commanded across the galaxy. Humanity's reputation was now spreading like wildfire among the other alien empires. Those who had once viewed the Zorth as the ultimate conquerors were beginning to wonder if they had made a fatal mistake by crossing paths with Earth's people. Word of the humans' resistance and their brutal efficiency in battle began to filter through the galaxy, and Velker understood all too well that the Zorth were no longer the apex predators they once believed themselves to be. The galaxy had witnessed the rise of something far more dangerous: humanity. The Zorth were running out of options, and Commander Velker knew it. Earth's human resistance had pushed them to the brink, and they were no longer able to hold their ground with the same ease they once did. Their technological superiority had been neutralized by the humans' ingenuity, and their once feared fleet was now a disjointed mess, unable to respond to the relentless assaults from every direction. The planet had become a battleground, with the humans fighting back with an almost uncanny precision and speed, using everything from homemade explosives to repurposed alien weapons to strike at the heart of the Zorth military. With every victory, the humans began to push the invaders further back, and Earth's cities, once decimated, were now becoming fortified strongholds of resistance. The Zorth had failed to realize that humanity had an advantage they had not counted on: a deep-rooted unity in the face of annihilation. Earth's people were no longer just defending their homes. They were fighting for their survival, for their future, and for their very existence. As the human resistance continued to grow in numbers, new leaders emerged, uniting people from across the globe to join the fight against the alien invaders. And though they were still outmatched in terms of technology, they had the upper hand in terms of tactics and willpower. Meanwhile, Velker's reports were growing more dire. His commander sent news of more Zorth losses, more cities and installations overrun, more supply lines cut off, and more soldiers retreating in fear. It was no longer a matter of whether they could conquer Earth. It was a matter of whether they could escape with their lives intact. The human resistance had not only fought the Zorth to a standstill, but had begun to push them toward retreat. Earth's civilians and military forces, led by figures like Colonel Trent and Sergeant Amelia Brooks, had now become the driving force of a global rebellion that was gaining momentum with each passing day. They weren't just taking back their cities, they were taking the fight directly to the Zorth homeworlds, with plans already in motion for an all-out assault on their fleet in space. The humans had taken the fight beyond Earth's surface, and Velker's fears were becoming a reality. The Zorth were facing not just a rebellion, but the full wrath of a species they had underestimated. A species that had turned its own planet into a war machine, and now had the tools to go beyond their atmosphere. It was at this critical moment that Velker finally understood what the Zorth had miscalculated about the humans. They were not just a resilient species, they were a species capable of reinvention, of turning adversity into strength. While the Zorth had believed that superior technology would guarantee their dominance, they failed to account for humanity's adaptability, its unyielding drive to survive no matter the odds. The human forces weren't just taking out supply lines or disabling weapons. They were learning, evolving, and using the Zorth's own tactics against them on the battlefield. Sergeant Brooks led a small, elite team of soldiers to a critical Zorth outpost in the desert, a site that was vital to the alien forces for resupplying and staging further attacks. The team infiltrated the base using underground tunnels and strategically placed explosives, planting devices that would cripple their ability to call for reinforcements once inside. They quickly overwhelmed the alien guards with their expertise in hand-to-hand combat, something the Zorth never expected from a species they considered primitive and weak. When the explosives detonated, it was a signal to the rest of the human resistance that the time to strike had come. Earth's forces were now fully coordinated and united across all fronts this time. The Zorth were not fighting a fractured planet of divided nations. They were facing a unified world of people who had come together to wipe out the invaders who had dared to conquer them. Commander Velker, who had once believed that Earth's surrender was inevitable, now saw the truth in front of him. The Zorth Empire was on the brink of collapse, and the humans were not just a threat to be fought off. They were a force of nature, unstoppable, relentless, and now in control of their own destiny. The war for Earth had entered its final phase, and the Zorth forces were scattered, demoralized, and cornered. Commander Velker's once mighty fleet was now a shell of its former self, barely holding together as desperate attempts were made to regroup. Across Earth, the human resistance, unified and unrelenting, had pushed the invaders to the brink of extinction. Major cities had been reclaimed, alien strongholds had been obliterated, and the Zorth were being driven back into the skies, their technological superiority rendered useless by the humans' creativity and willpower. What had begun as an invasion of Earth had turned into a humiliating retreat for the Zorth. The humans were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting to avenge the destruction of their world and secure their place in the galaxy. Colonel Trent, once an officer in Earth's military, now led a global coalition that spanned from the ashes of New York to the deserts of Africa, coordinating a final assault that would crush the remnants of the alien invaders. While the human forces regrouped and fortified their positions, they also prepared for the ultimate strike, a direct assault on the Zorth fleet still hovering above Earth. They knew the battle in space would be their final challenge, and victory would only come with one last decisive blow. On the ground, Sergeant Amelia Brooks spearheaded missions to eliminate the last of the Zorth ground forces. She led teams into alien bunkers and deep underground tunnels, hunting down the invaders with ruthless precision. Every Zorth soldier eliminated was a victory for humanity, but Brooks and her team knew that their true target lay above them, in the sky. The Zorth had made the mistake of leaving their fleet largely intact, believing that it was invulnerable to the humans. They hadn't counted on Earth's engineers, like Lucas Carter, who had worked tirelessly to develop technology to fight back in space. Carter and his team had reverse-engineered alien propulsion systems and weapons to create a fleet of human-made warships capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Zorth's best. It was a long shot, but it was humanity's last hope. With the fleet ready, Colonel Trent led the charge. The human space forces, once far inferior to the Zorth, now raced toward their destiny, a new kind of warship at their helm, sleek, fast, and deadly, built from both human ingenuity and the remnants of alien technology. Trent's fleet entered the final battle with the weight of humanity's survival on their shoulders. The Zorth, still struggling to regroup, met the human forces with everything they had left. But it was no use. The humans' tactics, their adaptability, and their sheer will to fight broke through the alien defenses. In the cold expanse of space, explosions lit up the dark sky as Zorth ships were torn apart by human firepower. For the first time in the war, Velcor felt the full weight of defeat. His fleet was falling apart, each ship a lifeless hulk in the vacuum of space. The Zorth had lost their grip on Earth, and with it, their hope of maintaining dominance over the galaxy. Velcor made one final desperate decision, sending a message to Earth's leaders, offering a ceasefire, a plea for mercy. It was too little, too late. Earth's response came swiftly: total surrender of Zorth forces, or nothing. The humans had won. The Zorth's reign of terror, once thought to be unchallenged, had been brought to a brutal end by a species they had once deemed weak and insignificant. The galaxy, once filled with tales of the Zorth's unchallenged power, would now learn the truth. The humans were not just survivors. They were the galaxy's ultimate killers. The Zorth fleet, once an imposing symbol of an unstoppable empire, was now a collection of shattered husks, drifting aimlessly in the void. Earth's skies, once filled with the terrifying silhouette of alien warships, were now clear, the battle won, and the planet's future secured. Humanity had done what no one thought possible. They had defeated an alien invasion, not with superior technology, but with the strength of their resolve, the creativity of their minds, and the unity of their people. As the dust settled, Colonel Trent stood before the United Nations Assembly in a moment that would go down in history. Behind him, images of Earth's cities, now free of alien control, flashed across screens. The global coalition that had come together to defeat the Zorth now stood united in victory, and the world looked to its leaders for guidance on what would come next. But as the world celebrated, a new reality began to dawn on humanity. They were no longer just defending their home. They were now players on a galactic stage, and the universe had taken notice. Sergeant Amelia Brooks, now a symbol of humanity's unyielding spirit, had become a hero not just on Earth, but across the galaxy. Her leadership and bravery had inspired millions, and stories of her relentless pursuit of the Zorth invaders had spread far and wide. But as humanity began to rebuild and look beyond the remnants of the war, Brooks knew the fight wasn't over. The Zorth were just one empire among many, and the galaxy was vast, far too vast to remain ignorant of the fact that Earth had just become the site of one of the greatest military victories the universe had ever seen. The Zorth were defeated, but there were other alien species watching from the shadows, wondering how a supposedly primitive species had managed to overcome such a powerful foe. And with the Zorth's defeat, new questions began to emerge. What did Earth's newfound strength mean for the rest of the galaxy? Could the human spirit and ingenuity, once underestimated, now make them a threat to empires far beyond their reach? Lucas Carter, the genius behind Earth's fleet of newly designed warships, was already pushing the limits of human technology, making modifications to the alien systems they had captured. The once primitive species was now on the cusp of advancing into a new era of technological power. But Carter's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of caution. The Zorth had fallen, but humanity had no idea what awaited them in the vastness of space. The battle for Earth had been won, but the battle for the galaxy had just begun. As humans celebrated their victory, there was a somber realization that the universe was not a place of peace and cooperation. The Zorth had been ruthless conquerors, but they were not the only threat out there. And now that Earth had shown its strength, others would come to test it. For Velker, the once mighty leader of the Zorth, there was nothing left. His empire had crumbled, his people scattered to the far reaches of space, and his homeworld now a shadow of its former glory. As he fled the wreckage of his fleet, Velker's mind raced with one thought. Earth had proven to be a force far beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. What they had accomplished was not just a triumph of arms, but a statement that echoed through the stars and into the farthest reaches of space. Humanity was not to be underestimated. They were no longer just a species struggling to survive. They were the galaxy's ultimate killers, and they had just shown the universe that no empire, no matter how powerful, could stand against them. And so, as the galaxy watched Earth's rise, one question remained: what would humanity do next? The universe had taken note of the humans' victory, and it was only a matter of time before the next challenge would come. But for now, Earth was united in victory, a world that had learned that their greatest strength was not their technology, but the unbreakable spirit that had turned the tide of the war. Humanity had become a legend.